Hello, welcome everybody to our Kanban New Zealand meetup event this month with Mike Burrows. Between spaces, scopes, and scales, and what frameworks don't tell you. Mike has been in the scene, specifically in the Kanban scene, for a long time, and many of you might know his book from our classes, maybe from Dance in my classes, Kanban from the Inside. You get a discount when you come to our classes. And afterwards, he also he wrote the books Agenda Shift and many more. He's actually doing a lot at the moment, and I let him explain that because he can do that a lot better. Welcome, Mike. Dan, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, I do. So there's just a few things, Silke. So welcome everyone. So I'm Daniel. If you don't know me, I run the Kanban Melbourne and Sydney meetups. And something very interesting that's going on now is that last year Mike spoke at our first Kanban Australia conference. And we do have our Kanban Australia conference running again in October. This year it will be in Sydney. We do still have the super early bird discount available if you wanted to attend. So that gives you 20% off, which occurs at the register. So that'll be on Friday, the 18th of October. And bit of news that we haven't put on the website just yet is that we'll be getting Patrick Stayat of Upstream and Customer Kanban fame coming out to Australia. So we're just getting the details of his talk, sort of finessed, and then we'll put all of that on the web, which will hopefully be next week. So all of the information about Kanban Australia conference is available on the website, which I've linked to there. And, if you do have a talk that you wanted to bring along, it'd be great to see any or all of you there in October later this year. So thank you all very much. Silke, back to you.
The call for speakers is open as well.
Yes. Yep. Call for speakers is open.
Oh, yeah. So I think there is nothing more to add, and I would hand over to Mike.
Cool. Well, I'll share my screen. So between spaces, scopes, and scales, what the scaling frameworks don't tell you. Now, I'm not going to have a big session bashing the scaling frameworks or anything like that. What I'll be presenting is really a bit of theory and a bit of practice that helps you understand some of the problems of scale. Problems that the frameworks don't help you very much with. They are problems not of process, but of how we organize. I say how we organize rather than problems of organization, because these things aren't static, they're not fixed. And if we want adaptive, agile organizations, we need to understand how organizing works. I won't give you the full picture on that today, but we're going to look at a particular set of challenges, the relationships between different scales of organization, a much neglected area really, and I think we will do a much better job of scaling if we understand those better. So following on from Silke and Daniel's introduction, yeah, I'm the author of a few books. Kanban from the Inside is the one I guess most relevant to the Kanban community certainly, but that's not all that I've been doing. 2015, 2016, that sort of time, so getting on for 10 years now. I've been very much focused on outcome orientation. How do we help groups of people have conversations in the language of needs, obstacles, and outcomes? And these are actually strategy conversations. So I've been getting very much more into strategy and leadership in the last few years. I started the Agenda Shift Academy around the beginning of COVID, focusing on leadership and strategy in the transforming organization. So that's the kind of area in which we've been working. Now, as a side effect of doing the second edition of the Agenda Shift book, I was actually invited, commissioned to write another book. So you'll see the new title on the left with the American spelling. That's the commission. Organizing Conversations, Patterns of Dialogue for the Transforming Organization. That is just about finished. I'm waiting some final comments before that actually goes into production. That'll be quite a short book. It's for a series of books in dialogic organization development. So we're talking about the approaches to organization development that aren't about experts telling you what to do. They're about helping the organization have the conversations with itself that it needs to have. That's really what I've been working on for the last few years. And the next book, book 5, Wholehearted, Engaging with Complexity in the Deliberately Adaptive Organization. That is essentially the book of this talk. You'll be getting a bit of chapter 4, essentially, in this talk today. And the training I did in Melbourne last year with Daniel, that was leading in a transforming organization, that's called. That is the training that is becoming the new book, and I'm super excited about that. That is the passion project at the moment. Right, so I'm just going to introduce myself and the model through a couple of stories. So back in 1998, I am that old. Back in 1998, I was leading a small team of developers in front office IT at an investment bank. And they decided that the year leading up to the introduction of the euro for government bonds was the perfect time for the bank to rewrite its P&L system for bonds, profit and loss system for bonds. They decided that the old system wasn't going to cope with the volumes and with the intricacies of the conversion and all the rest of it. You know, not an untypical banking project. That's not the interesting bit. The interesting bit is how these things work together: strategy, delivery, assurance. And the strategy was to do everything possible in our power to avoid a big bang delivery. So we delivered, tested, ran in parallel, made things live very, very incrementally. Simple instruments first, more complicated instruments later. Book by book, currency by currency, and so on, we went live. And actually, we went live ahead of schedule, which is remarkable for a mission-critical system, which this was, to completely rewrite it, to go live ahead of schedule, and to pass the euro conversion events, you know, with flying colors and so on. So the strategy was to avoid any kind of big bang implementation, to deploy as incrementally as we possibly could. That guided the delivery. That was the bit that I led. Now, my contribution to this, the most productive afternoon's programming I have ever done, was to make the data that the assurance people needed available to them via the browser. Now, that doesn't sound very radical now in 2024, but in 1998, that was still quite a new thing, and for a bank, especially internally, to have, you know, data via the browser. Strategy relative to assurance, the relationship there is interesting, because actually the assurance team vastly outnumbered everybody else and vastly outnumbered my little development team. And they weren't generic QA analysts. No offense to generic QA analysts, but these were senior finance people, senior operations people, people with deep of many of them absolutely over all the tons and tons of data that our P&L system was capable of producing. With this happy, balanced arrangement of strategy, delivery, and assurance, as I mentioned already, we went live early. So that's story number one. Story number two is exactly 10 years later. So do the maths, is 2008, and I'm still working for the same investment bank. And I'll tell you now that that particular organization was UBS. Now, if you know anything about banking, if at that time, certainly you're watching the news, you might remember that UBS was having a truly terrible time. It's the height of the credit crisis. After that project in 1998, I'd done like a tour of the bank, starting out as a developer, then as an architect, then as a manager, and so on. And when those 10 years were over, I was leading that same department that I'd been a developer in 10 years previously. I was back in fixed income at the height of the credit crisis. Absolutely catastrophic. And how this happened is very interesting in terms of strategy, delivery, assurance again. The strategy was, well, they outsourced their strategy to one of the big consultancies. You can probably guess which one. Got them to do a benchmarking study. How do we compare against our competitors? And they said, oh, you're not doing enough business in US mortgage-backed securities. Now, if you watch The Big Short, great film, really recommend The Big Short. You will understand what a terrible piece of advice that was. That was an advice to go into a market that none of the people involved actually properly understood. But that was the strategy. And the strategy was very strongly held. It was very enthusiastically delivered, actually scandalously enthusiastically delivered. Metaphorically, at least, the Treasury in Switzerland sold their gold bars and bought US mortgage-backed securities instead. I mean, it was that ridiculous. Meanwhile, some of the assurance guys were actually ringing the alarm bells. Our own research people, the people that would tell the bank's customers what they should be buying and selling, were saying, don't touch this stuff, it's toxic. So how is it that a bank can be telling its clients not to do something, yet the organization is piling in? Doesn't make sense. When the final reckoning was done, UBS did survive. And actually, if you watch the news, the banking news, you'll know that UBS has since taken over Credit Suisse. I mean, they've recovered enough that they could actually rescue another bank. But when the final reckoning was done, they lost $50 billion. Absolutely catastrophic amount of money, and they were very, very fortunate to survive it. So one little model, strategy, delivery, assurance, two very different stories, one about a successful project, one about an organizational catastrophe. Now, I mentioned my agenda shift book. I mentioned having the kind of conversations that we need, strategy conversations and so on. I'm going to start with a little reflective exercise. We're going to imagine a little reflective exercise. Imagine through those relationships, the relationships between strategy, delivery, and assurance, each element helped to their full potential, every element contributing to the success of the whole. And then you can imagine in breakouts what we call the I-do pattern, ideal, obstacles, outcomes. When that's working at its ideal best for us, what's that like? What's that like when strategy, delivery, and assurance are working together in that constructive way? Whose needs would we be meeting? What new stories could they tell? And then obstacles, what stops that, what gets in the way, and then outcomes. What would you like to have happen? Then what happens? Then what happens? And more elaborate conversations that we can have around those. Now, we're not going to do that. First of all, it's a pain to do in Zoom. Not everyone in a meetup wants to do breakouts either. We can think instead about how we can actually improve that model. So we've got a model that applies to projects and organizations. And as you saw, projects that went well, organizations that went terribly. And what actually I was after was a model that described something slightly more specific, viable organizations, organizations that are improving their capacity for independent action in a changing environment. Now, I will admit there are multiple definitions of viability about. I'm focusing on this one that's about independent action. The dictionary definition, and the one most often used in the systems community, is about independent existence. But independence of existence is vastly overrated. We are interdependent. And actually concentrating on what is capable of independent existence actually turns out to be a major, major distraction. Independent action is key. And this definition is actually after John Boyd. John Boyd of OODA loop fame. Now, you may remember that he was a fighter pilot. It's all about having options. If you're a fighter pilot and run out of options, game over. That is seriously bad news. But it's the same for organizations as well. If you're an organization running out of options, that is seriously bad news. And what we need processes, systems that keep us in the game, keep us healthy, keep us always having options. Now, if that's what the model needs to do for us, we need to make some changes. We don't need to change the structure so much as what's in the circles. So delivery becomes delivery, discovery, renewal. It's not enough just to deliver. We need to make sure that we are delivering the right things, that we're seeing the right opportunities or the right threats, for example, and we need to be renewing ourselves, developing capabilities, improving capabilities, and so on. You need something to guide all that. adaptive strategizing, that's where the options get created. That also, there's the self-governing aspect as well, making sure we're doing enough discovery and enough renewal relative to our delivery. And assurance becomes mutual trust building. Now, it's a bit of a cliche to say that organizations are built on trust, but it's really true. The economists would tell you that it's true. Psychologists would tell you that it's true. Even the systems people will tell you that it's true. Organizations are built on trust. Now, the actual picture I use is slightly different. I draw it like this with these overlapping spaces, as I call them. Now, there's spaces and they overlap because there's some structure hiding behind these different boxes. And that structure comes from a classic model from the 1970s called the viable system model by Stafford Beer. And there are literally thousands of pages written on the viable system model. It's a very well established model, very well documented, but very much also of its time. It is very much a systems thing, quite analytical in the way that it's applied. And I'm doing something quite different with it now. I'm hiding the detail, as much detail as you need space by space. And always the chance to zoom back to this top level view, the top level view at which I first told those 3 stories. And by doing that, yes, this looks super, super simple, but it's not simplistic. And in fact, it makes it much easier to see what's happening between different scales of organization. So between individual and team, between team and team of teams, between team of teams and its department, its division, whatever. And the important thing there is that we're looking up. It's not top down, it's much more bottom up. And this makes it much easier to model organizations that aren't hierarchies. If you look at the literature from the 1970s, most organizations were organized hierarchically. That is not, well, even then that was a simplification, but now it's just not realistic. You know, we need to understand things as relationships, not as hierarchical structures. So we've got a very flexible theory, a theory that actually plays really well with complexity as well. There are so many of these relationships. The relationships I'm showing here, the relationships inside each of these spaces and so on, thousands and thousands of relationships and more relationships between people and how they work, the tools they use, the work they're doing, their workloads and so on. You know, we really are in the realms of the complex adaptive system, if that means anything to you. Now, this is all a little bit abstract. So we're going to bring it to life with something that looks more like Kanban, which is going to be good for many of the people on this Zoom. So, and to help us do that, we're going to borrow Klaus Leopold's flight levels model. Now, I just want to recommend another book, obviously buy my books, but I recommend you buy Klaus's book as well, Rethinking Agile, a really great book. It's thought-provoking and entertaining both at the same time, which is a great combination to have. And we're going to look at some real organizational challenges that you will probably recognize at least one, maybe, possibly, probably even all 4. So structures with poor fit. Now, you might not know what that means yet, but you soon will, and you probably suffer from it, or you may suffer from it. The wrong things managed in the wrong place. Oh, yeah, there's the book. The wrong things managed in the wrong places, a very common problem. Dealing poorly with surprise. And actually, this is key to adaptation, to adaptivity. Organizations ignore most surprises. There's any surprise then that, you know, they're actually very slow to respond to change in the environment. Disappointed customer, disappointed organization. I'm sure that never happens in your organizations, but I've definitely seen that happen. Let's leave it like that. So flight levels. We'll start with a team. This is a team that has enough capability to deliver value independently, sufficiently cross-functional, sufficiently autonomous to deliver value independently. And we're representing the team by a Kanban board here, not because flight levels insist that you use Kanban boards. It certainly doesn't, and nor am I insisting that either. It's just convenience. We can see how they work and what they're working on and so on. Start with teams. You can assemble teams into larger things, into value streams. Now, I remember from my banking days, we used to talk a lot about front to back projects, things that started in front office, finished in operations, or possibly vice versa. The initiative might come from operations, and work its way upwards. And we could achieve a remarkable amount with teams just talking to each other, not a project manager in sight. You know, we weren't a projectized organization at all. We were a team-based organization. But there does come a point where for something to land at the right time, you need to at least make sure that things are started at the right time. And to do that well, you need an overview of how long things take in each team and all those kinds of things. So on top of that first flight level operations, that's all of your value streams, we have a level of coordination. That might be a sophisticated thing. It might be, just as I said, just making sure that we start the right kinds of things at the right kind of time. So that's flight level 2 coordination. And we have a layer on top of that in flight levels, strategic portfolio management. Now, the way I would describe this as teams on their own, just as teams on their own can't decide when to start things if the end-to-end is going to work, value streams on their own can't make sure that the overall mix of work that the organization has is the right mix of work in terms of the organization's strategic objectives, in terms of its risk appetite, and so on. There needs to be some kind of overview on it all. So that is strategic portfolio management. And I'll stress it again, doesn't have to be done with Kanban, but it can be, it might be. The question now is, when you're experiencing pain in any part of the organization, is that pain the result of something you are doing locally, or is it referred pain? Are you suffering from a deeper problem that's actually quite hard, unless you know just a little bit of the theory, to understand where it's coming from? So we'll go through those 4 problems that I mentioned. We'll start with the first one, structures with poor fit. Now, this actually is more common than people realize, I think. You may recognize this situation. There's kind of 3 kinds of problems. There's the kind of problem that you can easily assign to a team, typically smaller problems, but it might be larger problems, but they just happen to fit the team really well. They're the really big problems where you're good as long as you can find a sponsor to sponsor it. Perhaps the PMO will take ownership of it and organize everything for you, and you're good. And then there's a no man's land in between where nothing seems to fit. Those medium-sized projects without a clear sponsor, they are really hard to get done. And yet you can also see that some of those medium-sized things actually are quite important. And perhaps you're seeing a theme emerge as well. We keep getting this kind of thing needing to happen, and it's not happening. Why is that? Well, your organization, its structure isn't a good model for the challenges that it faces. Most often that means it's not a good model for the environment that it serves. It's a poor fit for its environment. This thing about organizational structure is actually important. It actually helps us understand the environments that we serve. And I'll give you a little example. It's not, in fact, it's not a little example, it's an enormous example, but a nice little tool to help understand it. So I'm going to think about the healthcare system of your country, and a healthcare system in the broadest possible sense of your country. I'm very familiar with how it works in the UK, less familiar with how it works in other countries, but I think a lot of the broad details are the same. And a nice model by a friend of mine, Patrick Hoverstadt, he wrote the book, The Fractal Organization, a book that has actually some of the theory that I'm leaning on here. And this model goes like this: customer, geography, technology, time. You can slice your environment, your business environment, by those dimensions, and you can do it in whatever order you want to do it, and you can do it more than once, and so on. But in this example, it works really nicely to do it in this order. So for healthcare, we're asking, with customer, geography, technology, time. I'm sorry, I forgot to hit the clicker. So customer, who are they? Who are the customers? Who are the patients in this case? Whose needs are we meeting? Geography, where do those needs occur? Where would we find those customers, and so on? Technology, whose needs should we be meeting? When we can start to think about with what, And technology is really anything that can meet a need, a tool, a service, bit of knowledge, whatever it might be. And the time dimension, when do those needs occur and to what extent do we need to account for that? So for the healthcare system, customer very neatly splits into two at the highest level. You might not have thought about this before, but there are two kinds of patient. There are those that pay for their own healthcare, and there are those that don't. There are those that are served by the private healthcare system, and there are those that are served by the state-based healthcare system. So in the UK, private healthcare, the NHS, the National Health Service. Very nice split there. Works very well in the UK. I don't know how well that works in your country, but in the UK, that is a very nice top-level split. And then geography. Now, this turns out to be a really important dimension for healthcare. So my personal family situation is such that I know what it's like to have healthcare professionals come to my house on a regular basis, not for me, but for a family member, come to my house on a regular basis. There are also things like doctors, clinics, located around hospitals, small, larger hospitals, teaching hospitals, national centres of excellence, and so on. I mean, you can't have brain surgery in your own home. You might not want to have brain surgery in your own little, local cottage hospital either. You want to have your brain surgery done where there is the expertise, where there's the capital equipment necessary, and so on. So you want to do that at a teaching hospital or even a national centre of excellence where the top brains of the country and the best equipment of the country are brought together. So you're managing that tension between local need and local delivery of the easier things versus the need to concentrate expertise and equipment. So that's geography. Technology. Now walk into a hospital and what do you see? You see signs for neurology. You see signs for the names are suddenly going of all those different medical things. But you got all these different ologies that all map to a different system in the body. And it's interesting that the hospital, in a way, is actually a model of the human body, or the human body is the model around which a hospital arranges itself. And you get that, that'll do for technology. Time. Now, this is a really interesting dimension. So think about your hospital again. You might have, for example, cradle to grave as a time dimension. You've got fertility, you've got maternity, you've got postnatal, got pediatric, adult medicine, geriatric medicine. For however many years, our needs change over our lifetimes, and the hospital provides different services to account for them. There's another life cycle. How about prevention, diagnosis, treatment, rehabilitation? Again, there's some hospital organization or healthcare system organization around those different things. You might have an emergency anytime, day or night, 24/7, but no healthcare professional can be in the accident and emergency department 24 hours a day. The hospital has to organize some kind of shift pattern to make sure that there is adequate provision at appropriate times of day, 24/7. That's the time dimension. The time dimension is really important in product development as well. There is people that don't know that your product even exists. They might not even be that sure that they have a need yet. Perhaps they need reminding that they've got a need that they didn't actually understand was solvable. And then they become aware of you. And then they might kick the tires a bit to find out a bit more about you. They might try your product. They might get skilled in your product. They might become champions for your product. And in product organizations, you may find that actually there are bits of organization devoted to those different stages of the user life cycle or the customer life cycle, if you like. So if you want an organization with better fit, make sure you've got some good answers to these questions. Now, the bit of wording at the top comes from my outside-in strategy review. If you read the Agenda Shift book or the Right to Left book, the Right to Left book's got a whole chapter on outside-in strategy. But imagine reaching the right customers, meeting their strategic needs, their needs, our strategy. We need to have good answers to those questions: customer, geography, technology, time. Who are they? Where are they? Whose needs should we be meeting? When do they have those needs? If you don't have good answers to your questions, or worse, well, the worst thing is not having answers to those questions because you don't know. But what the fit problem is when you have answers to those questions, but it's not clear in your organization whose job it is to respond to them. And this is an exercise you can do at team level, at value stream level, product level, whatever level. Reaching the right customers, meeting their strategic needs, who, where, what, when. So that's the fit one, very much about structure. Next one's the wrong things managed in the wrong places. I'm going to zoom down onto one corner of the board. So we're looking at the work flowing across at team level, and work flowing very nicely perhaps at team level, but it does leave a question: how do we represent that progress at the level up? And representing it as a card might not be an answer. It's possible that card is going to move so slowly at that higher level, it doesn't actually tell you anything. So we need to think about different ways in which we measure progress. And actually, we should ask some proper questions about, well, what does progress even mean? Can we measure things other than just cards moving across a board? And we need to get to something meaningful. So if we're thinking in terms of features, if that's what we're developing, it's the so that of your user story or your job story. You know, we're delivering this feature as some persona. We are doing some feature, or they want some feature, so that something meaningful. I think even better with job stories. In some moment of need, I want X so that I can make meaningful progress out of my struggle. Understand those struggling moments, understand what progress means for them. Think about how you might possibly measure that get some evidence that they are making that progress. You've got something to measure. So measure what matters. Measure real customer progress. I mean, measure process performance as well, but don't kid yourself. That's not what you're trying to achieve. You are trying to achieve something meaningful and valuable for your customers. And you can think about, well, what would be the first signs, the first tiniest signs that we are meeting those needs, that something interesting is happening with the customer. And then we can think more aspirationally: how will we know that we're winning? How will we know that we've won? What are our goals? What are our aspirations? Can we measure those? And, you know, thinking in metrics terms, we're starting to think we're making a separation between leading indicators and lagging indicators. We work on the leading indicators, and the lagging indicators give us later confirmation that we've been doing the right kind of things. Now, the difference here the thing between the scales here is that if all your metrics look identical at every level, there's a good chance that one of those levels isn't adding much value. Does the higher level, if the higher level level is managing the same metrics as the lower level, well, what value is it actually adding? You know, it should have a view over more things. It should have a longer time horizon, and so on. So make sure that at each level you've got the metrics that are appropriate to the level, metrics that it is capable of acting on, metrics that tell it something meaningful about its progress. And that takes us to managing the right things in the right places. So there's a couple of ways in which we can get this wrong, and it's pretty unpleasant when we get this wrong. So the higher level managing the lower level detail, we all know what that's called. That's micromanagement. It feels horrible and it's destructive. It destroys agency. It destroys innovation. You're telling people that actually have the skills to get the job done, you're telling them what to do. I mean, how wasteful is that when you've hired people with experience and skill and imagination to do these things? Very, very destructive. But you can set people up for failure the other way as well. You can take someone who's got power in the lower level and make them responsible for business outcomes at a level over which they have insufficient influence. A lot of project managers, maybe product managers too, complain that they don't have business sponsorship. I think that's what's actually happening. They've been set up for failure. The project's been sold on the basis of the outcomes it's going to deliver, and someone's called their bluff and said, all right, then you deliver those, not taking responsibility for their own business. And I think that's pretty appalling behavior as well, myself. Either way, micromanaging or getting people responsible for things over which they have no control, you are setting people up for failure. Next one, dealing poorly with surprise. Now, my background's in mathematics. I use the word surprise on purpose. Surprise is pretty synonymous in mathematics with information. If a piece of data has no surprise in it, it hasn't really told you anything. So if you can't deal well with surprise, you actually deal very poorly with information. And I think that actually says something about our organization. So what do you do when you hear something surprising? So let's take a really trivial example. And let's say you hear that customers prefer buttons to be green rather than red. Okay. What do you do with that information? Well, you can say, well, who cares? It's just a button. It's just a color. We're going to ignore it. It might turn out to be significant. That might be, or not. It might turn out to be a good call or a bad call. You might decide to adjust. So you might decide, well, okay, we'll change our colors. Or perhaps we should make it possible for the customer to choose their own colors. For the buttons, a bit more elaborate solution. Let's share this. Perhaps teams around us need to know that this customer doesn't like red buttons. Now there's a cost there. It costs to share, and it's potentially a distraction to those other teams. If you share, there's a choice to make, real judgment call whether or not you share this information. And that's the thing about this ladder that we're climbing. It may be the right decision or the wrong decision to keep climbing up. You might make a reasonable decision not to do any of these things. Strategize, come up with some options. These are things that we can do, things that we prefer to do, things that maybe we need to do some research on or whatever. Come up with options. That's what strategizing is. And with those other groups, we need to make sure that what we do is coherent. It's going to be worse for the customer if one team decides to do one thing and another team decides to do something else. We don't need perfect alignment on everything, but we need to at least be coherent. So there needs to be some reconciliation, choosing of most appropriate options, not based only on our own preferences, but also based on what other groups around us would like to do as well. We need to structure our response, decide what we're actually going to do, and organize around it, turn those ideas, those options into actual commitments that we are now mobilizing ourselves to deliver. Now, the thing is, I've presented what happens in teams, but in a rather weird order. I started with a surprise, not with a decision to do a piece of work. Now, if you think about Scrum or Kanban, you decide to do a piece of work and the surprise comes later. You find something about the piece of work or a dependency or about the customer response that surprises you, and you deal with it. You've got a piece of work that the team needs to respond to. One person might pick that piece of work, or you might, as a team, decide, well, actually, we need to self-organize around this. This is a job for 3 or 4 people, or whatever. You have your 3 amigos conversations, thinking about the process and so on. These are things that teams do really well. But organizations, they find it a lot more difficult. They're much more reluctant to climb that ladder, and that is why I believe that organizations are as unadaptive as they are. They're ignoring opportunities. They're ignoring the signs that perhaps things aren't as they should be, that they aren't, or for example, organized as they should be. They're not making the adjustments that they need to make. They'd rather stay with the current plan that they've got. They're not sharing what they know. Perhaps by sharing, they will find out, well, actually, this is just a piece of noise. We've heard different intelligence from elsewhere. And when we put it all together, we can form a clearer picture. They're not strategizing, not coming up with options. They're leaving it to other people to do. There's not enough reconciliation happening, not enough making sure that we are doing something coherent overall. Very slow to structure the response, to organize, to mobilize, and so on. And so this is from one of my assessment tools. You don't need to understand much about the scoring scale here to realize that in the opinion of those doing the survey here, organizations are very poor at doing this, very poor at recognizing that new structures need to emerge in these kinds of situations. So that's dealing better with surprise. And fourth problem, the last one, disappointed customer, disappointed organization. So I'm sure this never happens to any of you, but I have seen it happen, that you've delivered a piece of work and the customer wasn't entirely satisfied. They weren't delighted. Or perhaps you did delight the customer, but you did it in such a way that the organization itself wasn't so happy with. You know, some policy was violated, or you overspent in terms of money or something, but that was surprising to you. And then what we're going to do here is work back to where things went wrong, where there was what I call a failure of context. You didn't know what you needed to know in order to deliver a delighting solution. How do those failures of context happen? And investigating those failures of context is actually a really powerful way of improving your process, improving your organization. Now I'm going to do something, I should warn you now that when you've seen this, you won't be able to unsee it. So I'm going to invite you to think about every vertical line on your Kanban boards as representing a relationship. Not just a handoff from one activity to the next, but a relationship. And a relationship, not just activity to activity, column to column, but a relationship between all that went before and all that goes after, all the upstream, all the downstream, a relationship. And we can start to think about ways in which that relationship might be dysfunctional. Is one side doing what might be better done by the other, or in collaboration, or deferred until needed? And that covers an awful lot of different problems. I mean, that's not the universal dysfunction, but it does cover an awful lot of dysfunctions. And we're suffering a failure of context. What it is about this relationship that allows us to get to this point, not deeply understanding the customer need, the customer struggle, what the solution would look like, what's acceptable in the eyes of the customer, what would be acceptable in the eyes of the organization, and so on. And a really interesting way to tackle the problem if this is happening repeatedly is to dig into that relationship and asking, should we, across this relationship, be coordinating, cooperating, or collaborating? Do we let the board cooperating? Do we just let the board and our stand-up meetings and everything else, you know, we trust the system and it just works? Or do we need to cooperate a bit better? Do we need to break things down, agree how things integrate, agree how things synchronize, and so on? Or do we need a deeper relationship, a collaborative, more creative relationship between these two halves of the process? Nice little correspondence with Cynefin here, if you're a fan of Cynefin. So something's simple pieces of work. Coordinating is all you need. You know, the board will tell you what to do. The board will tell you the state of the work. Nobody will be surprised by the state of the system, by the state of the piece of work. But something more complicated, it may be necessary to break it down, agree those synchronization points, and so on. For things that are complex, we need to expect things not to work as we think. We need to expect that engaging with a problem will change our understanding, may change everybody else's understanding, may change everything. You know, we've got to expect some of our experiments not to work. We've got to be prepared for that. And we need people around us prepared for some of those failures and so on. What is our default for this relationship? And perhaps on a work item by work item basis, we need to be having that conversation. Do we coordinate, cooperate, or collaborate? So that becomes a question for your, you know, at the beginning of your piece of work, those three amigos conversations or the equivalent conversations that you have when you're starting a piece of work, do we coordinate, cooperate, collaborate? Who do we need to be involved in this? Much less likely that you can have a failure of context if you have the right people represented there. People who have the deep, deep knowledge of the customer, people who understand the policy, the organizational policy implications, and so on. And, the takeaway here is to be a keeper of context. Notice when people are struggling for context. Notice when work is being done by people who don't understand the context into which it's going to be delivered or the policies that should be governing it. Not necessarily for you to have all the answers, but to wonder, how did we get to here? What is it about our process? What is it about our role definitions? What is it about the way that we conduct our meetings that allows us to get to here, where people don't have the context they need to make great decisions, to deliver great work? So be a keeper of context. I said, once you've seen this, you won't be able to unsee this. These relationships are everywhere. Every vertical line on your Kanban board represents a relationship, a horizontal relationship between the upstream and the downstream, or a vertical relationship between different levels of scale. Do people have the context they need at every stage in the process to do great work? Is the best way to provide that context tons of documentation, or do we need to be cooperating more, collaborating more? How do we avoid those failures of context? So these relationships, as I said, they are absolutely everywhere. And going back to the beginning, you can imagine these relationships too, ideally balanced in every respect. Every relationship helping those it relates achieve their full potential, every element contributing to the success of the whole, ideal, obstacles, outcomes again. When all of that is working at its ideal best, what's that like? Whose needs would we be meeting? What new stories could they tell? What stops that? What gets in the way? What would we like to have happen? Then what happens? We can apply that specifically to the interscale relationships. We could dig into the spaces. We can look at the relationships between spaces. We can apply that to our networks, us in the middle, those we interact with, those that they interact with, and so on out. We can apply that to the web of interactions between different scopes of organization. That reconciliation I talked about, the strategy web, you could call that. So finally, to wrap this up, start where you are. Pretty familiar phrase in the Kanban community. Start where you are, from your scopes, in your networks. That's with the scopes that you identify with, probably scopes plural that you identify with, in your networks at the scale you best understand, structuring, translating, reconciling, connecting. Who, where, what, when. Make sure your organization is a good model of its challenges, a good model of its business environment. Translating ends before means, the right things managed in the right places. Making sure you're managing meaningful progress, meaningful performance. Reconciling, responding well to surprise, allowing self-organization to happen more often at every scale, and connecting. Be a keeper of context. Be sensitive to people not having the context they need. Think more relationally about your organization, not just relationships between colleagues, but relationships between different aspects of the organization. Are they healthy, balanced, and productive? Start where you are, everywhere, all at once, and then the fun starts. Now, everywhere all at once sounds like a recipe for chaos, but it's very hard to do anything meaningful in your one scope if everything around you is fixed. You actually want your colleagues around you in those different scopes asking some of these same questions. That will make it much easier to achieve something meaningful. Change things only in one limited scope, you may actually make things worse. It's a cliche again to say that change is a team game. It's actually a game for multiple teams, multiple interacting teams, and then the fun starts. So I'll leave it there. If you've been affected by any of the issues in this program, as we say in the UK, there is a place you can go to for help. agendashift.com/keynotes. It's got a PDF of the slides. Actually, it's got a PDF of the last version of the slides. I will update that today, and if we can get we can hopefully get the recording of this video of this talk onto that web page. This is the latest version. References, books and stuff, where I get this stuff from, various events that we run, many of them free, access to things like the assessment tools, the Leading with Outcomes modules. You can study, and I know many of you on the other side of the world to me, and much as I love coming to Australia, and I would love to visit New Zealand one day, you know, we are a long way apart in time as well as in miles. Much of my stuff is available in self-paced form as well, and there's a facilitator and trainer program as well. I'll just finish with a couple of things in the diary, just one slide. So the next trainer is in May. It's 4 afternoons, sorry, UK time. The training I did in Melbourne end of last year, I'm doing in Berlin and London in June. June's going to be a very, very busy month for me. I know that's a long way away for most of you. Silke's coming to Germany, so maybe we'll meet up in Berlin. But if you're dialing in from a more convenient location, then look those up. agendashift.com/keynotes has got the links to the events and everything else. And we're open now, I think, for Q&A. And I always say, you know, I don't mind the hard questions. Those are the ones we're going to have the interesting conversations about. So keep them coming, and I'll stop sharing, and I'll throw it back to Silke and Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. That was really good. It reminded me of all of the things that we talked about here when you were in Melbourne, and it was really great to hear this again. And I forget how much I know about this stuff when you go back over it again. And I particularly like that you included in the presentation the phrase, you know, why is that important? You know, because that was a thing that dropped out of our Melbourne conversation.
Yeah, use that a lot. Yes.
Yeah,
The cheat mode. Yeah. So if you don't know what we're alluding to, 15-minute photo. That's the clean language coaching game that I created a few years ago. It now has a cheat mode, which asks a very non-clean question. Why is that important? But that question is itself quite an important one. It comes from challenge mapping. You know, an idea that's decades old, but quite current thanks to Design Sprint. Yeah.
From my side, Mike, what I really liked is that you actually showed the first version of this book.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that.
There is
that was an accident.
No. I actually prefer this one because the second one goes into actually flight levels, and I must add, what I like about the first version is it doesn't actually talk about any frameworks, methods, or whatsoever.
Yeah,
that's what I really like about it. And the second one actually goes into that direction a little bit. So I would recommend to anybody buy the first version because that's really where the thinking comes from.
Okay, I couldn't actually tell you which version I read. I just grabbed the picture off the internet. Yeah.
By accident, a good one. And I liked also that the part about the surprises, especially about data and mathematics. I love that.
Yes.
Yeah. There is a question from Anthony in the chat. Anthony, do you want to unmute and ask it yourself? Are you still there?
Well, I can see the question in chat. So start where you are, everywhere, all at once. Differs from theory of constraints, where where change at the bottleneck is the thing that moves the needles. Can you help clarify the apparent conflict here? Right. So what we're doing is something that's kind of orthogonal to process-based approaches. I think this is the power of it. Actually, I'm not suggesting by any stretch that things like theory of constraints, queuing theory, Kanban, Scrum, whatever, process-based approaches, which they are predominantly, I'm not suggesting that they're not important. But there's a whole load of challenges, things like the structure of your organization, for example, who manages what, relationships that are or not productive between how the work is done, how it's coordinated, how it's organized, for example, where ideas come from, how we self-govern, how we make sure we've got the right balance of delivery, discovery, and renewal going on. The fact also that, you know, there's that main flow of work across your value streams that theory of constraints is great at understanding. But there are other really important information related things happening in your organization, how, you know, intelligence gets shared, how people's insights get shared, how you act on those. And the fundamental problem of organization, well, one of the two fundamental problems of organization is actually there is not enough decision-making and communication capacity to go round. When I said organizations are built on trust, it is for that reason. You can't actually be everywhere all at once. You have to take certain things on trust. You have to be digging in also into the right things as well and using your judgment and your skill and your personal presence, your personal attention, and all the rest of it. Theory of constraints, great at the value stream level, doesn't have so much to say about these organizational challenges. And you know, I think it's a real problem actually for Agile is that it's trying to scale itself without actually really thinking deeply about what scale really means, how organization really works, what theory could be helpful to us, and all the rest of it. And we are going back to things that are process-based and reliant on queuing theory. I studied maths. Queuing theory is a fantastic, wonderful thing, but it's not the only game in town. And by having a different perspective, a more organizational perspective, a more relational perspective, a more complexity-friendly relationship perspective, you make it possible to find a different kind of constraint. Now, constraints are very important also in complexity science. If you want to change a complex adaptive system, you've only got two choices. You can give it a big kick and hope that when it settles down into a better configuration than the one that it's in, or you move some of the constraints under which it operates. So move some of those constraints that change how it coordinates, change some of those constraints which change how it organizes and what it organizes around. There's not much else that you can do. Constraints, that is a more general version of constraints than is understood by theory of constraints. And what I'm getting to is that we need perspectives other than the flow perspective, other than the process-based perspective, that are more relational, more about organizing. Organizing as a dynamic thing, not as just as organizational structure. And if we are going to do a good job of scaling anything, I think it's important to understand these things. It worries me that if you try to scale process without understanding these things, all you're going to get is bigger process. You know, you see the chuckle. You know, we've all got the poster in our minds now, haven't we? You know, no, I said I didn't come here to bash safe, but the thing I don't understand is if we have some organizational challenges, why do we think that rolling out a big framework is the answer to them? Why don't we try and actually understand how those challenges arise and deal with them directly? And that puts us into a much better place. Now, I've got more sympathy with the people that talk about descaling, you know, remove the obstacles to scale. I agree with that, but also I think it's helpful to have the theory that actually helps you do a great job of that much more quickly, much more effectively, not just with the theory, but also because if you've got a participatory approach, which everything I've been doing for the last nearly a decade now is participatory, you can have not just the mind of the one expert, but a room full or a hall full of minds. And out of the conversations, you start to understand, well, what are the relationships here that aren't working as well as they could be? What are the constraints that are affecting us in unhealthy ways? And even though different people come from different parts of the organization, the same themes start to emerge. And these are themes that might not occur to you if all you were looking at was at the flow of work across a value stream. So that's why participation is important. That's why thinking about organizing in a richer way is important as well. In the end, you need the conversation having the conversation with itself that it needs to have. Super, super important. You know, there is more to an organization than its value streams. So I don't know if
Very wise words. Thank you
that
so
was
much, Mike.
from Anthony. I don't know if Anthony's still on, but I hope that that answered your question. Yeah.
There is Jeremy actually, and thanks Jeremy for actually sharing the event through Agile Alliance. Do you like to unmute and explain your question?
Thanks, Silke. Thanks, Mike. Let's see if I can remember it, because I can't see my chat message on the phone.
Something about keeper of context, yes.
Yeah, I like, and it occurred to me as you're answering Anthony's question as well. So I like this idea of keeping context or helping with that. And as I look at some of these organizations, and I see as we put people into roles to like be the context holder or like in a product management role, and that context sometimes becomes unwieldy. And that's why I think you're motivated to talk about these relationships between people. And if we would like to help that by becoming sort of keepers of context, how do we also not become that bottleneck of context or
yes, I completely agree with you. And you know, there's only so much I can talk about in the talk, and it would be a bit of a side issue if I spent time on it, but it actually comes up in two of the training modules. And we are training people to recognize when people don't have the context that we have. And it's not the knee-jerk reaction to provide that context, to fill in the missing information, but actually to wonder, how is it that we got to here? And the trick is working backwards. So we've got a conversation that's not working well, work backwards to the conversation that hadn't already happened that would have made this one a more productive one. If people are struggling for context in the work that they're doing a piece of work that's likely to fail because they're working without the context that they need. What is it about role definitions, for example, and process design and organization structure and so on that allows this to happen? How are we keeping people too insulated from, for example, customer context? Why is customer context suddenly only what's in the head of the product owner rather than something that every team member actually empathizes with? You know, and I've seen that particular problem, you know, addressed, you know, very powerfully. And when I was so I was global. And, you know, when I came back off my grand tour of the bank, I came back as executive director, leader of a global department. We had every permanent member of the department, we're talking, you know, 100 odd people, spending at least a week on the trading floor. And it was a really powerful thing because our developers and other people came back with a much deeper appreciation of the challenges that the traders faced on the trading floor. And also they brought their technical expertise to the trading floor and were able to show the traders and other people on the trading floor more effective ways of using the technology. And powerful relationships were formed, relationships in the business, that's always a good thing. But a much deeper appreciation of what everyday life was like for a trader. You start to realize that the system isn't only the system as designed in code, it's also the post-it notes around the screen. And you start to see the deficiencies in the system, and you start to see the worries on the part of users of the system and so on. And so with that deeper empathy, you get much better results. I was interim delivery manager on two government digital, they were called government digital exemplar projects. About 10 years ago, the UK radically changed how it did government digital. It borrowed from Estonia, which was doing a good job, and the UK did spectacularly well, 10 or more years ago, completely changing the way digital was done. Start with needs, user needs, not government needs, was the mantra. And if you couldn't prove that you deeply understood user needs, then your project would be canned, or at least stopped. or at least put on pause until it got its act together. You know, it was serious stuff. And these exemplar projects were pioneering projects that were going to show the rest of the country how these projects could be done. So I was delivery manager on 2 of those, and getting the empathy for the end user was a really important part of the process. And we would attend. I'm not a UX person. I'm not a user researcher. But I and other team members, all other team members, would attend user research sessions. We'd be behind the one-way glass and things like that, or watching on a monitor how these sessions were going. And you learn things that you would never learn just from talking to a product owner. And you develop a real empathy for the end user as well. And you hear some great stories about how these things, or sometimes very moving stories about how these things are used. So I did 2 projects. One was called Find an Apprenticeship. And you can guess what that's about. And, and if it wasn't for real life user research, you wouldn't understand that some of the ways that the tool was used was it would be a student with their phone under the desk having a sneaky look at the website while they're supposed to be in class, and realize how important mobile is, for example, to the end user. On carers allowance, there was a very moving video of a carer trying to use the old system while his wife, who had dementia, was pacing around the room behind him. And he was almost in tears of frustration with the old system, with all of this going on behind him. Very powerful, very moving. And you realize just how important it is to build systems that really have the user in mind, that don't waste the time of the user. In government systems, you want users that are entitled to use the system to stay in. You want users who are not entitled to use the system to quickly realize for themselves that they are wasting their own time. We might not have the right to kick them out. Possibly by law, we can't kick them out. But, we make it clear as soon as we possibly can that somebody's wasting their time, but we make it as easy as possible for people to go right through the process. There's the sequence in which questions are asked is really, really important. The kind of language that you use, really important as well to make these things accessible. So this connection between the people doing the work and the people whose needs we are trying to meet, that's a really important one. And having the product owner as the intermediary all the time, I think, is a problem. I was doing some work where was it? It was in Singapore. And I asked the product owner, what do you do to help develop your teams, understanding of what we're trying to do and how the users are going to use this and what they're going to achieve from it and so on. And he said, well, they never ask. And my jaw kind of dropped, and he realized he said something rather stupid. But that's really what product owner needs to be. In a way, it'd be much better if it was like a customer champion or something. But we need relationships. We need people with empathy for the end user. We need people that understand each other's needs, understanding organizational needs as well as the user needs. I mean, government needs are still important. The need to keep things secure, for example, is important. The need not to give money to people that aren't entitled to it is important. But we need systems that really do respect the user. We need processes that respect the user. Back to that was a long ramble, but back to your original point. We can't rely on one person being the owner of all the information, the owner of all the context. Decision-making capacity and information capacity of the organization is finite, and it's not enough. And the more you can do for people to work independently but coherently in ways that you can rely on, the better you are going to be. Yeah. Answer your question. That was a long answer to your question.
Yeah. That's one thing I recall from your class as well, and the overall approach, Mike. I think it's very human-centric. So you're using words like relationship, conversations, empathy, all of those kinds of things, which is, it's a very human-centric approach to, understanding the system, which I think is you know, really special and probably lacking in some areas and
And
organisations.
I'll be honest with you, I've had to change in those regards. You know, I'm a techie, and that's my background. But I did realise I mean, those of you who've been around for long enough will realise that I kind of moved to the side of the Kanban community almost 10 years ago. I had my own thing to do, and that was the real reason. It wasn't like I was going off in a massive strop or anything like that. But I did worry sometimes that people were getting so excited about metrics and statistics and things that they were losing the meaning. And if you forget why you're doing what you're doing, you know, that's a problem. And I did blog once that if people come to me, you know, say a consultant came to me, you know, and all they're interested in was, you know, one particular metric, you know, improving lead time, improving net satisfaction or whatever, and they couldn't show an interest in what we were trying to achieve for our customers, for our users, then I would show them the door, you know, and I stand by those words. And I didn't want to be one of those consultants. Yeah, work should be meaningful. That's some people are motivated by that stuff, and I'm actually not denigrating that at all. But not everybody is. And customer needs for many people are what actually makes the work motivating. And the more that we can connect people to customer needs, the better job we're going to do overall. Yeah. So yeah, making work more human is very much part of it. It's in Kanban from the inside as well. I called it the humane, start with what you do now approach to change, and making our work systems, our coordination systems more humane is actually a key theme of Kanban. I celebrate Kanban for that, and its principles are, you know, consistent with that. It's not Kanban's job, perhaps, to explore the customer, but we need to be doing that. Maybe not Kanban's job to explore some of these organizational issues I spent the last few years exploring, but someone's got to do that. And those people that want to scale anything should pay attention to it, I think.
I think it does that. It depends on the practitioners that teach it. I think I've said actually a lot of that in the last 2 days in my TKP in a different language, of course.
Yep.
Because I totally agree with what you say, and I really have take an emphasis on those things, like especially with metrics. Make, you know, don't just do metrics for the sake of doing metrics. They do need to make sense. You need to solve a problem, and also the emphasis on people and culture. And here is a thing from me, Mike. You know, I'm an intercultural trainer. I'm actually running a talk myself next
Happy birthday.
next week about intercultural agility with a lens on Kanban, agile, traditional project management. And I think I will actually pick this great phrase of be the keeper of context. Have you heard in an intercultural context of low and high context cultures?
I have. I couldn't define them for you, but I have come across that.
I think that might be really interesting to add some food for thought, because there are cultures in the world that are high and low context. And I think that, and actually most of the cultures are high context. So we Westerners are usually low context. We don't need the overall situation so much, like, you know, the situation, how someone, the gestures, what's going around them. And most cultures are actually high context, 2/3 of the world population. So I actually think your talk, they would love your talk, like our Maori Aboriginal people, or also Asian people, African, South America. That's all low context.
Yeah. So I should dig into that. I think, thank you for that.
High context. I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
We did have a question from Paul Salmon about functional silos. Paul, did you want to come off mute and ask a question?
Yeah, so this is an idea of, I fully agree. When we don't have context, we build the wrong thing and we don't fit in, right? We're effectively and that's borrowing some of this from team topologies, but when you have, say, someone that's building databases and they don't have context and they get asked to do something, is it
Yes.
another pattern might be to allow the value stream team to automatically ask for their own database, and the database team, that's kind of the platform model, I guess. Platform is a product model. Is that
Yep.
another? Because it gets too much, right?
Yep.
Holding all those contexts becomes.
Well, I think if you're going back to team topologies, I think the best chapter of team topology is the one that talks about, domains and domain models and that kind of thing. And you think back to my, customer geography technology time thing. How do you understand your business environment? And if you've got a functional organization, that is in no way a model of the environment.
Yeah.
And it's even worse than that, because only some of those functions actually have any meaningful interaction with the environment. So you get a very filtered view of the world. You'll have a very different understanding of the world from a functional organization than you will from one where you have cross-functional teams.
Yeah.
Entirely cross-functional teams, that has its own scaling problems. You need as many. I found this in government digital. Government policy was that every team needed an X and a Y and a Z. The trouble is, when you had your X and a Y and a Z, that was all your budget already spent. And it didn't actually scale very well. You do need enabling teams. You do need platform teams that can cover perhaps multiple domains.
Yeah.
So there are challenges there. But if your organization structure doesn't help you answer questions about your business environment, you are always going to struggle for context.
Yeah.
So these things are all interrelated. You need a better structure that helps you manage context better. I mean, systems people call it, containing complexity. That's not the right term. That certainly rubs complexity people up the wrong way. Containing variety, if we're going to get technical about it, is what it's doing. But the better that your organization models the environment, the better it's going to absorb challenges coming from the environment. Now, there are other challenges. There are, technical challenges. There are regulatory challenges and all the rest of it that need addressing. As I keep saying, if you don't have good answers to those questions, then you're going to struggle.
Thank you.
Do we have any more?
Yeah, there is Anthony again. Not sure if he is here now. Yay.
What's the question?
He's just talking on mute, just to challenge you.
Right. Okay. My lip reading isn't that good. I'm deaf in one ear, but I haven't learned to lip read.
Are there
He's done
any?
the double bluff. He's unmuted and muted again.
Oh, Anthony, you're still muted. Ah, there we go. Oh, no, it's muted again. I think you must have some kind of technical problem, Anthony. It keeps muting itself.
iPads and phones are really good at that.
All right.
Just touch it and it goes twice.
Do we have the question in chat?
Yes. It achieved a psychopathic aim.
Oh, yeah. So I think it's comparing the Australian government digital experience with the UK government digital experience. I have not been close to the UK experience for a few years now, but I'm really proud of the time I spent in it. I wasn't actually a member of GDS, Government Digital Services. As I said, I was interim delivery manager for 2 of their exemplar projects, but that was really special times, both of those projects. Some of the credit, as I mentioned, should go to Estonia. The UK, picked up that baton and ran with it. The US has its own version of it as well. It sounds like the Australian version wasn't quite so successful, at least not in those regards. I don't know if there's a question there, but it's an observation that
we did attribute a malevolent aim in the end, like a hidden malevolent agenda.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I've got another question in chat. Do I have a theory about why organizations don't value spending the time to understand and share their contexts well? That's a really good question. One thing I'll be writing about in the book, thinking about, a complexity lens on organization. So much of what an organization isn't an in the moment best design of the organization. It is very, very path dependent. How we are now very much depends on our history. And if we've experienced something working well 20 years ago, remnants of it will still exist now. But the world is a different place to how it was 20 years ago. And as I was saying in response to an earlier question, your organizational structure, and this is part of path dependence, will change how you view the outside world. And going back to the bit of the talk about surprise as well, confirmation bias is a real thing. If you see information that doesn't fit with your understanding of the world, it's very easy not even to ignore it explicitly, but not even to notice it, not even to see it. It's the Dave Snowden example, the gorilla walking across the basketball court, you just don't see it. You don't know what you don't know. People are very unaware, or organizations are very unaware of just how much their view of the world is limited by the organization's structure and by its history. So I don't find it surprising. What we need to be doing is amplifying any information that doesn't fit. So going back to the talk, amplifying any kind of signal, any kind of project that doesn't have an obvious home in the organization, that should be a warning sign that the organization isn't well structured. Anytime it's clear that what we're building isn't getting the kind of response from the market, from our customers that we were expecting, those signals, you don't want knee-jerk reactions all the time, but you do need to take them seriously. And perhaps that should be a sign at least that we haven't spent the time understanding the customer needs well enough. We're not investing enough effort into understanding how users actually interact with our own systems, understanding user behaviors and so on from that point of view, and recognizing that it's only still a very narrow view on what the user is really thinking and doing at the time. So I kind of sympathize with organizations for not doing it, but at the same time, it's a real problem that they don't. And if an organization is stuck in a old understanding of the world, and the world has changed radically, which it has in the last few years, and will probably keep changing radically in the next few years, that becomes a problem. And yeah, you need to be watching for those disconfirmatory signals, and amplifying those best you can. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? And Daniel, if you like to unmute, because I think you asked the question, and I know I love, just talking to you because you have so many thought-provoking things to say, and feel free to respond.
Yeah, no, I think my theory is along the same lines. I describe it as certainty bias and rush to solve bias. So
Yes.
there's the lack of certainty when you're unpicking these things means we're more likely to just go with what we know and what we're familiar with.
Yes. Yeah, there's kind of two extremes, and organizations are guilty of both. There's a book I'm reading at the moment called A Failure of Nerve, and it's about leaders being a non-anxious presence, reducing as a good thing, reducing the anxiety of the organization so that it doesn't always reach for the quick fixes. If you've studied servant leadership properly, you'll understand it's not just about meeting people's environmental needs. It's also about connecting people to the purpose of the organization in society. I mean, it was a really big thing. As that evolves, as that changes, and so there are some things that are permanent or not so permanent, but still, you know, somewhat lasting, that we need leaders to stand for. And we need them not to reach always for the quick fixes. But at the same time, we mustn't be ignoring the signs that perhaps we're getting things wrong, and that's the tension that leaders have got to balance. I'm empathetic towards them. I realize that this is difficult. Sometimes it's right to ignore. Sometimes it's right not to adjust. Sometimes it's right to deal with something locally and not share the noise around the organization. You know, those capacities are finite, as I said before. But the more that we've got leaders who are actively thinking about those challenges, actively being non-anxious presences, but also wondering about what could we have got wrong, you know, the better our organizations will be.
Do you add a bit to that, Mike? I noticed in that you charged leaders with that responsibility of that
Yes.
non-anxious presence. And if that's causing other people to maybe react to local needs, is there some, just jumping back to some context that's not being shared there that requires leaders to hold that and can't be other people also holding it?
Well, you turn it around. You know, when I talk about leaders, you know, in a way, you are a leader if you are a non-anxious presence standing for the right things. I mean, going back to my training as well, you know, leaders, if it's an expectation on leaders to be engaging on the right challenges, to inviting people to work with them on those right challenges, and to share, to celebrate the innovations of others, you can say, well, that's the organizational expectation on a leader, or you can say, well, anyone who's doing those things is a leader. You know, and you know, again, going back to cliches, leadership at every level, it is a cliche, but the things I've described are things that we can see exhibited around the organization, and we can nurture those things. So we can nurture a reluctance to reach for the quick fix when there's something deeper to be understood. We can nurture people to be looking for interesting signals, to share them, and to wonder what they might mean, to make sense of them, and so on. You know, yeah.
I think there was another one from Anthony. I had some curiosity about whether there's a connection between flight levels and 5 different systems in a viable systems model. And
yeah, so I mean, there definitely is. A bit like my 3 spaces model. So that in a way, they're both simplifications of the viable system model. In a way, I don't think that's what Klaus was trying to do. But if you think about the top flight level, you know, that's the one that's got overall view. That's the one in the end that's got to make sure it's got the right balance of delivery and discovery and renewal going on. And that's a self-governing aspect. That's a system 5 thing. You've got the actual work being done on the ground. That's a system 1 thing that corresponds to flight level 1. And you've got some organizing that's happening in the middle. I mean, loosely, that's quite a nice correspondence with VSM. The downside is that you're losing the sort of fractal nature of VSM. VSM is a model that works at every scale in an organization. You know, teams are viable organizations, team of teams, viable organizations, divisions, departments, whatever. And the approach I'm taking in the book is every scope that you identify with, and you probably identify with multiple scopes in your organization. Not all of them even have a name. It might just be a group of people that just regularly work with each other. It might be the people that you meet for coffee. To some extent, there are some processes going on there that maintains the integrity, the identifiability, if you like, of those different things. So taking a very non-hierarchical view of things, a very participatory friendly view of things, a very complexity friendly view of things, seeing how these things interact, look at the relationships between them, look at the relationships inside them. You know, and it was just so there's just such a monstrous number of relationships there. It's very clear we are dealing with a complex adaptive system. No single observer can possibly have complete view of everything, and that's why participation actually is so important. You know, we want to have some conversations that are likely to have the right kind of important themes emerging. Not that we're going to come up with all the answers in one go, but we're going to come up with things that need addressing. And when we've addressed them, we'll find some other things that we can address. And it becomes not a challenge of designing the perfect organization on paper, but helping the organization become more adaptive, address its major dysfunctions, and at the same time become more adaptive. That seems quite a good win, or multiple wins. Yeah. So yeah, I think there are correspondences with the OODA loop as well. You know, in the end, these different models are trying to address some of the same things. I think the viable system model is special, is that it is from bottom up, first principles. It's used information theory and control theory to understand what really must be there and how must these different things constrain each other. And that again allows a more modern interpretation, constraint-based, complexity-based interpretation as well, and that's interesting. So that's what book 5 is going to be, majoring on. Yeah, so it'll be quite a non-traditional presentation of a classic model. Yeah.
Cool.
See, someone put a link to A Failure of Nerve App. I'd recommend that book. I'm about halfway through it at the moment, but yeah, recommend that book.
Yep, cool. And Anthony keeps on going, but that's just what he does.
It is kind of a little bit what I do. I was, when you were talking about the interaction, etc., it connected to me to the point of going, to really observe the system, you have to interact with it. By interacting with it, you change it.
Yes.
Come back to Heisenberg's organization.
Yes.
Or Schrodinger's organization again.
Well, it's the nature of adaptive challenges, isn't it? There are some challenges that are technical that you can analyze and come up with a plan for, but organizations aren't like that, and competitive situations aren't like that either. So there's some very important challenges where you must take a more experimental, complexity aware approach. Yeah. Not a rollout approach. Yeah.
Hang on, aren't we all going to be an involved organisation by September 1st?
Yes.
And Paul has just mentioned another one. But I would
That's right.
say maybe slowly we are ready to wrap up. At least stop the recording. We could. I'm not sure how you're going, Mike. We could stay on board at least for the organizers, maybe just for a few minutes.
Yeah.
And I'm actually open to others as well. But yeah.
We'll stop the recording at least. Then we'll tell you what we really think, Mike.
Yeah. That thing.
Well, stop the recording now. Then hit me.